The dust-stained letter trembled in Wilhelmina Ramsey's hands as she stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, reading words that sentenced her to a lifetime of misery with a man she had never met, but already feared with every fiber of her being. The afternoon sun blazed over the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878, casting long shadows across the parched earth, and she could feel the weight of her father's desperation pressing down on her shoulders like the oppressive heat that shimmered above the distant mesas. Her father, Thomas Ramsey, had lost everything in a series of bad cattle deals and even worse poker games, leaving their small ranch on the outskirts of Las Cruces teetering on the edge of foreclosure. The man who held those debts was Marcus Holloway, a wealthy landowner from Santa Fe whose reputation preceded him like a rattlesnake's warning. Stories circulated through the territory of his cruelty, of hired hands who disappeared after disagreeing with him, of a first wife who had died under mysterious circumstances, and of a temper that could ignite faster than dry tinder in a lightning storm. Wilhelmina had turned 22 that spring, and she had always imagined she would marry for love, not as payment for her father's mistakes. She had watched her mother die 3 years earlier from consumption, had taken over running the household, had learned to handle a rifle and ride as well as any man, and had dreamed of a different life than the one now being forced upon her. But when she looked into her father's haunted eyes that evening as he sat at their worn kitchen table, she saw a broken man who had already lost his wife and his pride, and she could not bring herself to refuse him this one thing he asked of her. The wedding was set for 3 weeks hence. Holloway would arrive in Las Cruces to collect his bride and take her back to his sprawling estate in Santa Fe. Thomas Ramsey would keep his land, and Wilhelmina would become the property of a man whose very name made her blood run cold. She spent those weeks in a fog of dread, going through the motions of preparing her trousseau, accepting the pitying looks from the women in town, and trying not to think about the fate that awaited her. It was during one of these somber preparations, while she was in town purchasing fabric for what would become her wedding dress, that she first encountered Jacob Foster. The general store was crowded that afternoon, filled with ranchers stocking up on supplies and women gossiping over bolts of calico. Wilhelmina stood at the counter, her arms full of white linen she could barely afford, when a tall figure in dusty riding clothes stepped aside to let her pass. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. She glanced up, intending only a quick acknowledgement, but found herself caught by a pair of startlingly blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and there was something in his expression that spoke of intelligence and kindness. For a moment, their eyes held, and Wilhelmina felt an unexpected flutter in her chest, a sensation she had never experienced before and certainly had no right to feel now, promised as she was to another man. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and then she hurried past him to pay for her purchases, her heart beating strangely fast. She did not know then that Jacob Foster had been watching her from the moment she entered the store, that he had been completely arrested by the sight of her copper-colored hair catching the light from the window, by the proud set of her shoulders despite the sadness that shadowed her green eyes. He did not know her name or her circumstances, but something in her bearing called to something deep within him, and he found himself asking the storekeeper about her after she had left. "That's Wilhelmina Ramsey," the storekeeper said with a sigh. "Poor girl is set to marry Marcus Holloway up in Santa Fe. Her father owes him money, and this is how he's settling the debt. Shame, really. She's a good woman, deserves better than that cruel son of a rattlesnake." Jacob felt his jaw tighten, He had heard of Marcus Holloway. Every cowboy and rancher in the territory had heard the stories. The man was notorious for his brutality, for buying up land from desperate men and working his ranch hands nearly to death. Jacob had been drifting through New Mexico for the past 6 months, working various ranches as he made his way south from Colorado, and he had deliberately avoided seeking work at Holloway's spread, despite the high wages offered, because he had heard what kind of man ran that operation. The thought of the woman with the sad green eyes being handed over to such a man filled him with a righteous anger that surprised him with its intensity. He barely knew her. He had exchanged perhaps 3 words with her. Yet something fundamental had shifted in his chest when their eyes met, and he could not shake the feeling that he had just glimpsed something precious that was about to be destroyed. Over the following days, Jacob found reasons to remain in Las Cruces rather than moving on to the next ranch job as he had planned. He took work at a spread just outside of town, helping with fence repairs and horse breaking, and he kept his ears open for any talk about Wilhelmina Ramsey and her impending marriage. What he heard only deepened his concern and his strange, growing obsession with a woman he did not know. Wilhelmina, for her part, could not stop thinking about the cowboy in the general store. She told herself she was being foolish, that she had no business thinking about any man other than her intended husband. But in the quiet moments before sleep claimed her, she found herself remembering those blue eyes and wondering who he was, where he had come from, whether he was still in Las Cruces, or had already moved on to wherever drifting cowboys went. She saw him again a week later, at Sunday services in the small church on the edge of town. She attended with her father, sitting in their usual pew, trying to focus on the minister's sermon about duty and faith, when she felt the prickle of someone's gaze on her. She turned slightly and saw him sitting several rows back, his hat held respectfully in his hands, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. After the service ended, as the congregation filed out into the bright sunlight, Wilhelmina found him waiting near the church steps. Her father had been caught in conversation with another rancher, leaving her momentarily alone, and Jacob seized the opportunity to approach her. "Miss Ramsey," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent a small thrill through her. "Forgive my boldness, but I heard about your upcoming marriage. I want you to know that if you need help, if there is any way to avoid this arrangement, I would do everything in my power to assist you." Wilhelmina stared at him, shocked by his directness and by the genuine concern in his voice. "I do not even know you, sir," she said, though her tone was not unkind. "My name is Jacob Foster," he said, "and you are right, you do not know me. But I know what kind of man Marcus Holloway is, and I cannot stand by knowing that you are being forced into marriage with him without at least offering you an alternative." An alternative? Wilhelmina felt her pulse quickening. What alternative could there possibly be? "My father owes Holloway a substantial debt. If I do not marry him, we lose everything." "How much is the debt?" Jacob asked. $3,000, Wilhelmina said, and the number hung between them like an impossible chasm. It was a fortune, more money than most cowboys would see in 5 years of hard work. Jacob's expression tightened, but he did not look away. "I do not have that kind of money," he admitted, "but there must be another way. You should not have to sacrifice your life for your father's mistakes." "And yet I must," Wilhelmina said, and despite her best efforts, her voice cracked slightly. "In 2 weeks, Marcus Holloway will arrive to claim me, and I will leave Las Cruces as his wife. There is no other way." "Miss Ramsey," Jacob said, taking a step closer, his voice low and urgent. "I know this sounds insane. I know we just met. But I have never felt about anyone the way I felt the moment I saw you in that store. I do not believe in fate or destiny, but I cannot shake the feeling that I was meant to be here, meant to meet you, meant to help you somehow." Wilhelmina felt tears prick at her eyes. The earnestness in his voice, the desperate hope in his expression, it all called to something deep within her that she had thought long buried under duty and resignation. "Even if what you say is true," she whispered, "even if I felt the same way, which I am not saying I do, what difference does it make? I am promised to another man. The arrangements have been made." "Then unmake them," Jacob said fiercely. "Run away with me. We could go to California, to Oregon, somewhere Holloway cannot find us. We could start a new life. And leave my father to face Holloway's wrath alone." Wilhelmina shook her head. "He would lose the ranch. He would likely lose his life. Holloway does not take kindly to being cheated, and that is how he would see it." Before Jacob could respond, Thomas Ramsey called out to his daughter, and Wilhelmina quickly stepped away from Jacob, her cheeks flushed. She rejoined her father without looking back, but she could feel Jacob's eyes on her as they walked to their wagon, and that night she lay awake for hours, her mind churning with impossible possibilities. Jacob, meanwhile, was consumed with the problem of how to save Wilhelmina from her fate. He could not simply stand by and let her marry Holloway. The thought of it made him physically ill. Yet he had no money, no influence, and no legal claim on her. He was just a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name but his horse, his saddle, and his skills with cattle and horses. He spent the next several days making inquiries, trying to learn more about Holloway's business dealings, hoping to find some leverage, some piece of information that might be useful. What he discovered was even more disturbing than the rumors. Holloway had a pattern of loaning money to struggling ranchers at reasonable interest rates, then calling in the debts early and offering to settle for goods, land, or in some cases, family members. He had acquired half his ranch land this way, and he had claimed at least 2 other women as brides through similar arrangements, though both had died within a few years of marriage under circumstances that were never fully investigated. The more Jacob learned, the more desperate he became. He could not let Wilhelmina become another tragic story whispered about in saloons and general stores. There had to be something he could do. It was during a conversation with an old vaquero at the ranch where he was working that Jacob learned something interesting. The vaquero, a weathered man named Miguel who had lived in the territory his entire life, mentioned that Marcus Holloway had a weakness for gambling, particularly poker. He had won and lost fortunes at the tables in Santa Fe, and he was known to be unable to resist a high-stakes game. An idea began to form in Jacob's mind, dangerous and desperate, but it was the only chance he could see. He had always been good at cards. His father had taught him to play when he was young, and he had supported himself through more than a few lean times by playing poker in various towns and camps. He had a talent for reading people, for knowing when to fold and when to press his advantage. If he could get into a game with Holloway, if he could win enough money, he might be able to buy Wilhelmina's freedom. The problem was that he would need a stake, enough money to get into a serious game. He had perhaps $50 to his name, which was nowhere near enough. He would have to win his way up, starting with smaller games and building his bankroll until he had enough to challenge Holloway directly. Time was running short. The wedding was now less than 2 weeks away. Jacob gave his notice at the ranch, collected his wages, and began making the rounds of the saloons and gambling halls in Las Cruces and the surrounding towns. He played carefully, conservatively, betting only when he had strong hands or when he could read weakness in his opponents. Slowly, painfully slowly, his stake began to grow. $50 became $100, then $200, then $500. Wilhelmina, unaware of Jacob's desperate gambit, moved through her final days of freedom like a ghost. She went through the motions of preparing for her wedding, accepting the gifts and well wishes from neighbors who did not know what else to say, all the while feeling as though she were walking toward her own execution. She thought often of Jacob Foster, of his startling proposal, of the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious and worth fighting for. No one had ever looked at her that way before, and now that she had glimpsed what that felt like, the prospect of spending her life with a cruel man she did not love seemed even more unbearable. She saw Jacob one more time before everything changed. It was late afternoon, and she had ridden into town alone to pick up some last-minute items for the wedding. She was tying her horse outside the general store when she saw him emerge from the saloon across the street. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, separated by the dusty street and by circumstances neither seemed able to change. Then Jacob crossed the street to her, moving with a determination that made her heart leap. "Miss Ramsey," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know something. I am doing everything I can to find a way to help you. I do not have all the answers yet, but I promise you I am not giving up. If there is any way to keep you from marrying Holloway, I will find it." Wilhelmina felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" Jacob reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the touch sending electricity through her entire body. "Because from the moment I saw you, something in my heart recognized something in yours," he said softly. "I know that sounds like the romantic nonsense of dime novels, but it is the truth. I have been drifting my whole adult life, never finding a place or a person worth staying for, until I walked into that general store and saw you. Whatever happens, wherever this leads, I need you to know that you are not alone. Someone is fighting for you." Wilhelmina could not find words to respond. She simply nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak, and then her father's voice called out to her from down the street, and Jacob stepped back, tipping his hat to her before turning and walking away. That evening, Jacob left Las Cruces and headed north to Santa Fe. He had built his stake to nearly $1,000, which was still far short of what he needed, but time had run out. Holloway was set to depart for Las Cruces in just a few days to collect his bride, and Jacob had to intercept him before that happened. His plan was audacious and probably foolish, but it was the only option he could see. Santa Fe was a bustling territorial capital, far larger and more cosmopolitan than Las Cruces. Jacob found his way to the Palace Saloon, the establishment where Holloway was known to play cards regularly. He spent the first evening simply observing, nursing a whiskey at the bar and watching the various games in progress. He spotted Holloway easily enough. The man was in his late 40s, powerfully built, with a florid face and small, cruel eyes. He played poker with an aggressive style, bullying other players with large bets and intimidating stares. Jacob waited until the second night to buy into one of the games. He started at a lower stakes table, winning steadily, letting his reputation as a skilled player spread through the saloon. By the third night, he managed to get a seat at Holloway's table. The game began civilly enough. Jacob played carefully, folding often, studying Holloway's tells and patterns. The man was good, there was no denying that, but he was also arrogant, and arrogance led to mistakes. Jacob waited for his opportunity, building his stack slowly, staying out of Holloway's way when the man was on a run of good cards. It was well past midnight when Jacob finally made his move. He had been dealt a full house, kings over tens, and he watched as Holloway bet aggressively on what Jacob suspected was a strong hand but not strong enough. Jacob called and raised, pushing a significant portion of his chips into the pot. Holloway's eyes narrowed, studying Jacob with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "You are new here," Holloway said, his voice a low rumble. "I do not believe I have seen you before." "Just passing through," Jacob said evenly, meeting Holloway's gaze without flinching. "Is that so?" Holloway studied his cards, then looked back at Jacob. "What brings you to Santa Fe?" "Opportunity," Jacob said, which was not entirely untrue. Holloway grunted and pushed a large stack of chips into the center of the table. "Raise." Jacob considered his options. He had Holloway beat. He was nearly certain of it, but the man could be bluffing, or he could have drawn to a straight or a flush. Jacob's entire plan depended on building his bankroll enough to make a real challenge. He pushed all his chips into the center. All in. A murmur went through the spectators who had gathered around the table. Holloway's expression darkened, but there was also a gleam of respect in his eyes. He called the bet, and when they turned over their cards, Jacob's full house beat Holloway's three of a kind. Jacob raked in the substantial pot, his heart pounding. He now had close to $2,000, more than he had ever had in his life, but still not enough. He needed to push further. Over the next hour, Jacob continued to play, and his luck held. He won more than he lost, and his stack continued to grow. Holloway, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated, drinking more heavily and playing more recklessly. Jacob could see the man's temper simmering just below the surface. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside the saloon windows, Jacob decided to make his real play. He had just over $3,000 in front of him, and Holloway was steaming from a series of losses. Jacob waited until he was dealt a strong hand, then looked across the table at Holloway. "I hear you have interesting ways of settling debts," Jacob said carefully. Holloway's eyes snapped to him. "What do you mean by that?" "I heard about Thomas Ramsey down in Las Cruces," Jacob said. "How you are taking his daughter as payment for his debt. $3,000, was it not?" Holloway's face darkened dangerously. "That is none of your concern." "What if I made it my concern?" Jacob said, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. "I have $3,000 here. One hand, winner take all. If you win, you take my money. If I win, you forgive Ramsey's debt and leave his daughter alone." The entire saloon seemed to go quiet. Holloway stared at Jacob with an expression that was equal parts fury and intrigue. "Why would you do that?" he demanded. "What is Thomas Ramsey's daughter to you?" "That is my business," Jacob said. "Do you accept the wager or not?" Holloway's face was purple with rage, but Jacob could see the gambler's addiction burning in his eyes. The man could not resist a challenge, especially not one made so publicly. To refuse would be to show weakness, and men like Holloway thrived on their reputations for being fearless and unbeatable. "Deal the cards," Holloway growled. The dealer, an older man who had been working the table all night, looked between them nervously. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should discuss this further." "Deal the damn cards," Holloway roared, slamming his hand on the table. The dealer dealt. Jacob picked up his cards with hands that he willed to remain steady. He had a pair of aces, a strong starting hand but far from unbeatable. He would need to draw well or outplay Holloway completely. They each discarded and drew new cards. Jacob drew 3 cards to go with his aces and felt his stomach drop when he saw what he had drawn. Nothing. Just ace high with a king kicker. But when he looked up at Holloway, he saw something in the man's expression that gave him hope. There was too much satisfaction there, too much eagerness. Holloway had drawn something good, but not great. He was planning to bluff his way to victory, counting on his reputation and his intimidation to make Jacob fold. Jacob had to make a decision that would determine not only his fate but Wilhelmina's as well. He could fold and walk away with nothing, or he could trust his read on Holloway and play the hand out. He thought of Wilhelmina's green eyes, of the sadness and resignation he had seen there, of the way she had looked at him when he promised to fight for her. "I am all in," Jacob said, pushing his entire stack into the center of the table. Holloway's eyes widened slightly, and Jacob knew he had been right. The man had been planning to bluff. Now he had to decide whether to call Jacob's bet with what was almost certainly a mediocre hand, or fold and lose face in front of the entire saloon. Pride won out over sense, as Jacob had gambled it would. Holloway shoved his chips forward. "Call. Let us see what you have got, Cowboy." Jacob laid down his pair of aces. Holloway's face went through a rapid series of expressions, from triumph to confusion to barely controlled rage. He had a pair of tens. Jacob had one. The saloon erupted in noise. Jacob sat frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe what had just happened. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had won Wilhelmina's freedom. Holloway stood up so violently that his chair crashed to the floor behind him. "This is not over," he snarled, leaning across the table toward Jacob. "You cheated. You must have cheated." "The whole saloon watched the hand," Jacob said, standing as well, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the handle of the revolver at his hip. "There was no cheating. You lost fair and square. Thomas Ramsey's debt is forgiven, and you will leave his daughter alone." "The hell I will," Holloway spat. "That girl is mine. We have a contract." "A contract that was contingent on a debt that no longer exists," Jacob said firmly. "You are a gambling man, Holloway. You made a wager and you lost. Live with it." For a moment, Jacob thought Holloway might draw on him right there in the saloon. The man's hand twitched toward his gun, and Jacob prepared himself for violence. But the saloon owner, a large man who had been watching the proceedings with interest, stepped forward. "Holloway, everyone here saw what happened," he said calmly but firmly. "The Cowboy won fair and square. You want to maintain your reputation as a man of honor who pays his gambling debts, or do you want word to spread that you welch on your bets?" Holloway looked around at the crowd of witnesses, his face contorted with fury. Finally, he spat on the floor at Jacob's feet and stormed out of the saloon, shoving people out of his way as he went. Jacob exhaled shakily and began collecting his winnings. Several men clapped him on the back, congratulating him on his nerve and his play. But Jacob barely heard them. All he could think about was getting back to Las Cruces, back to Wilhelmina, to tell her that she was free. He left Santa Fe immediately, pausing only to send a telegram to Thomas Ramsey, informing him that his debt to Holloway had been settled, and the marriage contract was void. Then he rode south, pushing his horse as hard as he dared, desperate to reach Wilhelmina before Holloway could somehow interfere or exact revenge. Wilhelmina received word of the canceled wedding from her father, who had gotten the telegram, and stood in their kitchen with tears streaming down his face, unable to comprehend what had happened. The telegram had been cryptic, saying only that the debt was paid and she was free, signed by someone named Jacob Foster. "I do not understand," Thomas kept saying, reading and rereading the telegram. "How is this possible? Who is Jacob Foster?" But Wilhelmina understood. Jacob had done it. Somehow, impossibly, the cowboy who barely knew her had found a way to save her from Marcus Holloway. She felt as though she could not breathe, as though the world had suddenly opened up into infinite possibility after weeks of narrowing down to a single dark point. "He is the man I am going to marry," she said softly, and the certainty in her voice surprised even herself. Thomas looked at his daughter in confusion. "What are you talking about? You have only just escaped one marriage. Why would you rush into another?" "Because he is the reason I escaped," Wilhelmina said, her eyes shining. Because he fought for me when he had no reason to, when he owed me nothing. Because when I look at him, I see my future, and for the first time in my life that future looks bright instead of dark." Thomas sank into a chair, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I have ruined so much," he said brokenly. "I nearly destroyed your life because of my foolishness and weakness." Wilhelmina knelt beside her father and took his hands. "You made mistakes," she said gently. "But you also raised me to be strong enough to face hard things. And somehow, through all of this darkness, I found something precious. I found someone who sees me, truly sees me, and thinks I am worth fighting for." It was late afternoon the following day when Jacob finally rode into the yard of the Ramsey ranch. He was exhausted, covered in trail dust, his horse lathered and blowing hard. But the moment he saw Wilhelmina emerge from the house and run toward him, all the fatigue fell away. She reached him as he was dismounting, and he barely had time to secure his horse before she threw herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her tightly, feeling her tears soak into his shirt, her body shaking with emotion. "You did it," she sobbed against his chest. "Somehow you did it. How?" "How did you manage it?" "Poker game," Jacob said, his voice rough. "I won enough money to challenge Holloway directly, and I bet everything on a single hand. If I had lost, you would be married to him tomorrow. But I won. You are free, Wilhelmina, you are free." She pulled back to look up at him, her face streaked with tears but radiant with joy. "You risked everything for me. You could have lost it all." "I had nothing to lose except the chance to know you," Jacob said, cupping her face in his hands. "And that was a chance I was not willing to give up without a fight." "I do not even know you," Wilhelmina said, but she was smiling through her tears. "I do not know where you were born, what your favorite food is, whether you prefer coffee or tea in the morning. I do not know any of the 1,000 small things that make up a life." "Then let me tell you," Jacob said. "I was born in Missouri. My favorite food is my mother's apple pie, though I have not had it in years. I prefer coffee, black as night and strong as a mule kick. I have been drifting since I was 18, working ranches from Kansas to California, never finding a place I wanted to stay. I am good with horses, decent with cattle, and I can read and write and do sums. I do not have much money, even after the poker game, because I gave most of it to pay off your father's debt. But what I do have, everything I am and everything I will ever be, I am offering to you if you will have me." "Yes," Wilhelmina said without hesitation. "Yes, I will have you. I will marry you, Jacob Foster, and I will spend every day learning all the things I do not yet know about you, and teaching you all the things you do not yet know about me." Jacob kissed her then, there in the dusty ranch yard with her father watching from the porch, and the New Mexico sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and dust and hope, a kiss that sealed a promise made in desperation and kept through determination, a kiss that marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find, but both of them had been searching for all their lives. Thomas Ramsey came down from the porch as they broke apart, and Jacob released Wilhelmina to face her father, unsure of what reception he would receive. But Thomas simply extended his hand, and when Jacob took it, the older man pulled him into a rough embrace. "You saved my daughter from a fate I could not save her from myself," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given her back her future. I can never repay that debt." "There is no debt," Jacob said firmly. "I did not do it for gratitude or reward. I did it because I could not stand by and let something terrible happen when I had the power to stop it." "Then you are a better man than most," Thomas said. "And if you truly want to marry my daughter, you have my blessing. More than that, you have my gratitude and respect." They married 2 weeks later in the same church where Jacob had first approached Wilhelmina after the service. The wedding was small, attended by neighbors and friends who were still buzzing with the story of the mysterious cowboy who had won a bride's freedom in a high-stakes poker game. Wilhelmina wore a dress of pale blue instead of white, made from fabric she had purchased with money Jacob had insisted she keep from his winnings. She looked more beautiful than Jacob had ever seen anyone look, her copper hair braided with wildflowers, her green eyes luminous with happiness. Jacob wore his best clothes, which were not much, just clean trousers and a pressed shirt, but Wilhelmina told him he looked perfect. They spoke their vows in voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in applause. The celebration afterward was held at the Ramsey Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and food contributed by neighbors who wanted to be part of this unexpected happy ending. Jacob and Wilhelmina moved through the festivities in a daze of happiness, barely able to believe that just a few weeks earlier, they had been strangers, and she had been facing a lifetime of misery. As evening fell and the party began to wind down, Jacob and Wilhelmina finally had a moment alone, walking together toward the pasture where his horse grazed peacefully. The sky was ablaze with color, deep purples and brilliant oranges streaking across the vast New Mexico sky. "I keep thinking I am going to wake up and discover this was all a dream," Wilhelmina said, leaning against Jacob's side as they walked. "If it is a dream, then I am dreaming it too," Jacob said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "And I never want to wake up. What happens now?" Wilhelmina asked. "Where do we go from here?" "That depends," Jacob said. "I am just a cowboy. I do not have a ranch of my own, no real home to offer you. I have been thinking that perhaps we could stay here, help your father with his ranch. He is getting older and the place needs work. Or we could head west, try to start something of our own. The choice is yours." Wilhelmina stopped walking and turned to face him. "The choice is ours," she corrected gently. "We are partners now, Jacob, equals. I do not want you making decisions for me or sacrificing for me. I want us to build a life together as a team." Jacob smiled and kissed her forehead. "Then, as your partner and equal, I suggest we stay here, at least for now. Your father needs help and this is your home. We can save money, learn the business together, and someday, if we want to start our own spread, we will have the experience and the resources to do it right." "That sounds perfect," Wilhelmina said. "Although I have to admit I never imagined I would be a rancher's wife." "What did you imagine?" Jacob asked. "I did not let myself imagine much of anything," Wilhelmina admitted. "After my mother died, I just tried to get through each day. I did not think about the future because the future seemed like something that happened to other people, not to me. But now, standing here with you, I can suddenly see it stretching out ahead of us, full of possibilities. We will have a good life," Jacob promised. "It might not be easy, ranch life never is, but we will have each other and we will face whatever comes together." They stood there as the last light faded from the sky, holding each other, and Wilhelmina felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She had been saved from a terrible fate, yes, but more than that, she had found something she had not even known she was looking for. She had found a true partner, someone who saw her not as a commodity to be traded or a burden to be managed, but as a person worthy of respect and love and sacrifice. Their wedding night was spent in the small room that had been Wilhelmina's since childhood, made private with new curtains her father had hung that afternoon. Jacob was gentle and patient, understanding that despite her age, Wilhelmina had lived a sheltered life and this was all new and slightly frightening to her. They talked long into the night, learning more about each other, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Jacob told her about growing up in Missouri, about how his father had been a farmer who lost everything in a drought and died of a broken heart, leaving Jacob and his mother to fend for themselves. His mother had remarried eventually to a man who had no use for a stepson, and Jacob had left home at 18 to make his own way in the world. He had worked ranches all over the West, learning the trade, saving what money he could, always moving on when the restlessness became too strong. Wilhelmina told him about her childhood in Las Cruces, about her mother's long illness and death, about taking over the running of the household at 19, and trying to hold everything together as her father spiraled into debt and despair. She talked about her fears when she learned she was to marry Holloway, about the nightmares she had endured, about the resignation she had felt, believing there was no escape. "I felt like I was drowning," she confessed, lying in the circle of his arms. "Like I was sinking underwater, and no matter how hard I struggled, I could not reach the surface. And then you appeared, like something out of a fairy tale, and suddenly I could breathe again." "You saved yourself too," Jacob said. "You had the strength to keep going, to not give up hope entirely." "All I did was give you an option you did not have before." "You did more than that," Wilhelmina insisted. "You saw me when I felt invisible. You fought for me when you had every reason to just walk away and let me face my fate. That means everything to me." As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, both of them felt a contentment that neither had known before. It was not just the physical comfort of companionship, though that was certainly part of it. It was the deeper satisfaction of knowing that they had each found someone who understood them, who valued them, who would stand with them against whatever challenges life might bring. The months that followed their wedding were busy and productive. Jacob threw himself into the work of improving the Ramsey ranch, repairing fences, breaking horses, managing the small herd of cattle with a skill and dedication that impressed Thomas. Wilhelmina continued to manage the household, but she also began working alongside Jacob in the fields and pastures, learning aspects of ranch management her father had never taught her because he believed such things were men's work. Jacob, however, had different ideas. He taught Wilhelmina how to read the land, how to judge the quality of cattle, how to negotiate with buyers and suppliers. He treated her as a true partner, valuing her opinions and including her in decisions. This was unusual for the time and place, and it raised some eyebrows among their neighbors, but Jacob and Wilhelmina did not care. They were building something together, and it required both of their contributions. As autumn gave way to winter, the ranch began to show the results of their hard work. The fences were sound, the cattle were healthy, and they had even begun to expand the herd with some careful purchases of breeding stock. Thomas, watching his daughter and son-in-law work together with such harmony and effectiveness, felt his spirits lift for the first time in years. The weight of his past mistakes still haunted him, but seeing Wilhelmina happy and the ranch prospering gave him hope that he might yet leave something of value behind. It was a cold December evening when Wilhelmina realized she was pregnant. She had been feeling unwell for several weeks, tired and queasy in the mornings, but she had attributed it to the hard work and the changing seasons. When she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth, she was filled with a mixture of joy and terror. She was going to be a mother. She and Jacob were going to have a child. She told him that night as they sat by the fireplace after dinner, her father having already retired to his room. Jacob had been reading through a catalog of farm equipment, making notes about supplies they would need to order in the spring. When Wilhelmina said his name in a voice that made him immediately set down the catalog and give her his full attention. "Jacob, I have something to tell you," she said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What is it?" he asked, concerned by her obvious anxiety. "Are you all right? "I am fine," Wilhelmina said quickly. "More than fine, actually. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Jacob stared at her for a moment, his mind struggling to process this information. Then a smile spread across his face, so wide and genuine that it transformed his usually serious features. "A baby," he repeated, as though testing out the word. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Wilhelmina said, starting to smile herself as his joy became infectious. "Sometime in late spring or early summer, I think. Are you happy about this?" "Happy." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I am more than happy. I am terrified and excited and grateful all at once." "A child, our child, I can hardly believe it." "I am terrified too," Wilhelmina admitted. "What if I am not a good mother? What if something goes wrong?" "You are going to be an amazing mother," Jacob said with absolute conviction. "You are strong and kind and patient. And nothing is going to go wrong. I will make sure of it. I will take care of you every single day until this baby arrives safely." True to his word, Jacob became even more attentive and protective as Wilhelmina's pregnancy progressed. He took over more of the heavy ranch work, insisting that she rest more and do nothing that might put strain on her or the baby. Wilhelmina chafed at this sometimes, not wanting to be treated as fragile, but she also appreciated his concern and his devotion. As winter turned to spring, Wilhelmina's belly grew round, and the baby began to move inside her. Jacob would spend hours with his hand on her stomach, marveling at the kicks and movements, talking to the baby about the ranch, about the horses, about all the things they would do together. It was during these quiet moments that Wilhelmina fell even more deeply in love with her husband, seeing the tenderness and wonder in him that he showed to few others. Thomas, too, was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. The news seemed to give him a new purpose, and he threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival with enthusiasm. He built a beautiful cradle from wood he had been saving for years, carving intricate designs into the headboard. He also began working harder on the ranch, determined to make it as profitable as possible so that his daughter and grandchild would have security. The baby came in late June, during a hot spell that had everyone moving slowly and seeking shade. Wilhelmina's labor began early in the morning and lasted through the day into the evening. Jacob stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when the pain became almost unbearable. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered most of the babies in Las Cruces for the past 20 years, remained calm and efficient throughout, guiding Wilhelmina through each contraction. Thomas paced nervously outside the room, occasionally trying to come in to check on his daughter, only to be firmly turned away by Mrs. Chen, who told him in no uncertain terms that the birthing room was no place for anxious grandfathers. Finally, as the sun was setting and the room was filled with golden light, Wilhelmina gave one final, tremendous push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to everyone within hearing distance. Jacob felt tears stream down his face as Mrs. Chen placed the squirming, red-faced infant in Wilhelmina's arms, and he looked down at his wife and child with a feeling of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "He is perfect," Wilhelmina whispered, her exhaustion forgotten as she gazed at her son. "He is absolutely perfect." "He is," Jacob agreed, gently touching the baby's tiny hand, marveling as the small fingers reflexively curled around his much larger finger. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Wilhelmina said, "James. I want to call him James Thomas after my father." Thomas, who had finally been allowed into the room, stood at the foot of the bed with tears running unabashedly down his weathered face. "You would name him after me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You are his grandfather," Wilhelmina said gently. "And despite everything that happened, you are a good man who made mistakes and tried to make them right. I want our son to have your name and to know his grandfather." Thomas could not speak. He simply nodded and reached out to gently touch the baby's head, his rough cattleman's hand trembling with emotion. James Thomas Foster proved to be a healthy, energetic baby who rarely seemed to sleep and kept his parents constantly busy. Wilhelmina discovered that motherhood was simultaneously more exhausting and more rewarding than she had imagined. The sleepless nights and endless feedings were hard, but every smile, every small milestone, filled her heart with a joy she had not known was possible. Jacob was a devoted father, involved in every aspect of James's care in a way that was unusual for the time. He changed diapers, walked the floor with the baby when he fussed, sang lullabies in his surprisingly pleasant voice, and showed no embarrassment about being seen doing what many men considered women's work. He was creating the kind of family he had always wanted but never thought he would have, and he threw himself into it with the same determination he brought to everything else. As James grew from an infant into a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Jacob's hard work and smart management had transformed the struggling operation into a profitable enterprise. They had expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and even begun raising horses for sale, capitalizing on Jacob's skill as a horse trainer. Other ranchers in the area began to seek Jacob's advice, recognizing his talent and dedication. Wilhelmina, balancing motherhood with her role as Jacob's partner in running the ranch, discovered reserves of strength and capability she had not known she possessed. She kept the books, managed the household finances, and still found time to work alongside Jacob when needed. Their partnership, born from desperate circumstances and sustained through dedication and love, had become something remarkable. When James was 2 years old, Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she was less frightened and more excited, knowing what to expect and confident in her ability to handle it. Jacob was equally thrilled, though he was somewhat more anxious the second time around, having witnessed firsthand how difficult childbirth could be. Their daughter arrived in early spring, a beautiful baby with her mother's copper hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Elena Marie, and she proved to be a much calmer baby than her brother had been, content to sleep for long stretches and rarely fussy. James, now a rambunctious toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and would spend hours sitting beside her cradle, talking to her in his limited vocabulary and trying to share his toys with her. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The days were long and filled with work, but they were also filled with love and laughter and the small, precious moments that make up a family's life. Jacob and Wilhelmina would sometimes catch each other's eye across the dinner table or while working together in the barn, and they would share a smile that spoke volumes about their gratitude for the life they had built together. Thomas, now in his late 50s, had slowed down considerably but still insisted on helping around the ranch as much as his aging body would allow. He doted on his grandchildren, telling them stories and teaching them about the land and the animals. The guilt and shame that had haunted him for years had finally begun to fade, replaced by a quiet pride in what his daughter and son-in-law had accomplished. It was on a warm summer evening, when James was 5 and Elena was 3, that Jacob and Wilhelmina finally talked about the events that had brought them together. They were sitting on the porch after putting the children to bed, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky when Wilhelmina said, "Do you ever think about that summer? About how close I came to a completely different life?" "I try not to," Jacob admitted. The thought of what might have happened if I had not been in that general store on that particular day, if I had not heard about your situation, if I had lost that poker game. It all terrifies me. "I think about it sometimes," Wilhelmina said quietly. Not in a morbid way, but just marveling at how fragile the line is between happiness and misery. If you had walked into that store 5 minutes earlier or later, we might never have met. If you had decided to move on from Las Cruces instead of staying to help me, everything would be different. "Do you believe in fate?" Jacob asked. "In the idea that some things are meant to be?" Wilhelmina considered this. "I used to not believe in anything," she said. "After my mother died and my father started gambling away our future, I thought the world was random and cruel, and that good things happened only by accident if they happened at all. But then you appeared in my life, and you fought for me when you had no reason to, and everything changed. So yes, I suppose I do believe that some things are meant to be. I believe we were meant to find each other." "I believe that too," Jacob said, reaching over to take her hand. "I spent so many years drifting, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. And then I saw you, and suddenly I understood what I had been searching for. I had been looking for home, and home turned out to be not a place but a person. Home is our children too," Wilhelmina added, "and this ranch and this life we have built. Home is all of it together." "It is," Jacob agreed, "and I am grateful for every single day of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night, the crickets chirping and the occasional low of cattle in the distance. Finally, Wilhelmina said, "I never asked you what happened to Marcus Holloway. Did you ever hear anything about him after that poker game?" Jacob's expression darkened slightly. "I heard he left Santa Fe not long after. Apparently, the story of him losing a bride in a card game damaged his reputation enough that he decided to try his luck elsewhere. Last I heard, he had gone to Texas, but that was years ago. I have no idea where he is now or what he is doing." "I hope I never find out," Wilhelmina said with a slight shudder. "I hope he has moved on and forgotten all about me." "Even if he has not, it does not matter," Jacob said firmly. "You are my wife, and I will protect you and our children from anything and anyone who might threaten you. Holloway is in the past, and he will stay there." As the years passed, the Foster family continued to grow and thrive. Thomas Ramsey passed away peacefully in his sleep when James was 7 and Alina was 5, content in the knowledge that his daughter was happy and his grandchildren were well cared for. His death was mourned, but it was not tragic. He had lived long enough to see his mistakes redeemed, to know that the ranch he had nearly lost was now secure and prosperous. Jacob and Wilhelmina inherited the ranch, which they renamed Foster Ranch, and continued to build on the foundation they had laid. They had one more child, another daughter they named Abigail Grace, who arrived when Wilhelmina was 30 and proved to be a perfect blend of her siblings' temperaments, energetic like James but calm like Alina. As their children grew, Jacob and Wilhelmina made sure to teach them not only the practical skills needed to run a ranch, but also the values that had sustained their parents through difficult times. They taught them about hard work and integrity, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about the importance of family and partnership and love. James grew into a serious, responsible young man with his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. Alina was more adventurous, always pushing boundaries and asking questions, determined to understand how everything worked. Abigail was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and brought everyone together. Jacob and Wilhelmina watched their children grow with pride and occasional wistfulness for the swift passage of time. They had both expected parenthood to be difficult, and it was, but it was also endlessly rewarding in ways they could never have anticipated. Every milestone, every achievement, every challenge overcome together strengthened the bonds that held their family together. When James turned 18, he announced that he wanted to start his own ranch, to take what his parents had taught him and build something of his own. Jacob and Wilhelmina, though they would miss having him around, understood and supported his decision. They helped him purchase land about 20 miles north of Foster Ranch, gave him some breeding stock to start his herd, and sent him off with their blessing and their pride. Eleanor, at 16, announced that she wanted to train horses professionally, to develop a breeding program that would produce the finest horses in the territory. This was more controversial, as horse training was considered a dangerous occupation and certainly not one for young women. But Jacob and Wilhelmina had not raised their daughter to accept limitations based on her gender. They supported her ambition and helped her pursue it, even as some of their neighbors shook their heads in disapproval. Abigail, the youngest, remained at home longest, helping her parents run the ranch and showing a particular talent for managing the business side of the operation. She was the one who suggested they diversify into sheep ranching, who negotiated better contracts with buyers, who kept the books with meticulous precision. As Jacob and Wilhelmina entered their 40s, and then their 50s, they began to slow down, letting their children take on more of the day-to-day responsibilities of running the ranch. They did not retire exactly, but they allowed themselves more time to simply enjoy each other's company, to take long rides through their land, to sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mesas. It was during one of these quiet evenings when they were both in their mid-50s that Wilhelmina said, "I have been thinking about our story, about how it all began." "What about it?" Jacob asked, his hand finding hers as it always did. "I want to make sure our grandchildren know it," Wilhelmina said. "Not just the broad strokes, but the details. The fear and the desperation, the courage it took for you to challenge Holloway, the leap of faith we both took in marrying each other when we barely knew each other. I want them to understand that sometimes life puts you in impossible situations, but that does not mean there is no way out. It just means you have to be brave enough to find it. Or lucky enough to have someone find it for you," Jacob said with a smile. "It was not luck," Wilhelmina insisted. "It was choice. You chose to help me. You chose to risk everything on a single hand of cards. You chose me, even though you did not know me, even though you had no reason to believe we would work out. Those were choices, Jacob, not luck." "Maybe," Jacob conceded, "but you made choices too. You chose to trust me, to take a chance on marrying a drifting cowboy with nothing to his name but a good horse and better intentions. You chose to build this life with me, to be my partner in every sense of the word. So if we are talking about choices, yours were just as important as mine." They sat in silence for a while, both reflecting on the journey they had taken together. From that first chance encounter in a general store in Las Cruces to this moment, sitting together on the porch of a prosperous ranch surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built, it had been quite a journey. "You have any regrets?" Wilhelmina asked suddenly. Jacob considered the question carefully. "I regret the years I spent drifting before I found you," he said finally. "All that wasted time when I could have been building something meaningful, but everything else, no, I have no regrets. This life, this family, you and our children and now our grandchildren, this is everything I ever wanted even when I did not know I wanted it." "I have no regrets either," Wilhelmina said. "Not even about that terrible summer when I thought my life was ending. Because if that had not happened, If my father had not gotten into debt, and if Holloway had not demanded me as payment, we would never have met. I would never have known what it felt like to be truly loved, to be seen as an equal partner, to build something meaningful with someone who valued me. By the time Jacob and Wilhelmina reached their 60s, they had 8 grandchildren between their 3 children, and Foster Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in southern New Mexico. Their reputation for fair dealing, quality livestock, and innovative practices had spread throughout the territory, and their children had built on that foundation to create their own successful enterprises. James had expanded his ranch significantly and was raising some of the finest cattle in the region. He had married a schoolteacher from Las Cruces, a smart, capable woman who reminded Jacob and Wilhelmina very much of themselves. They had 3 children, all boys who were already showing signs of following in their father's footsteps. Leaner had indeed become a renowned horse trainer, and her breeding program had produced horses that were sought after throughout the West. She had married another horse trainer, a man who respected her skills and treated her as an equal partner. They had 2 daughters and a son, and Leaner was already teaching her daughters everything she knew about horses, determined that they would have the same opportunities she had fought for. Abigail had eventually married the son of a neighboring rancher, combining their 2 properties into a substantial spread that produced both cattle and sheep. She had 3 children, and she ran the business side of their operation with the same precision and intelligence she had brought to helping her parents. Jacob and Wilhelmina, watching their children and grandchildren thrive, felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that the choices they had made all those years ago had led to this. They had not just saved themselves from unhappy fates. They had created something lasting and meaningful that would continue long after they were gone. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at Foster Ranch, bringing the entire extended family together for a weekend of feasting and storytelling and laughter. Jacob and Wilhelmina, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they had been given. During the celebration, James stood up and called for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his glass. "To my parents, who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. Who built this ranch and this family from almost nothing, through hard work and dedication and unwavering commitment to each other. We are all here because of the choices they made 30 years ago, and we are better people because of the example they set." To Jacob and Wilhelmina Foster. To Jacob and Wilhelmina. Everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Jacob pulled Wilhelmina close, kissing her temple as she wiped away happy tears. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" he whispered. "Not in my wildest dreams," Wilhelmina whispered back. "This is so much better than anything I could have imagined." As they grew older, Jacob and Wilhelmina spent more time reflecting on their life together and less time worrying about the day-to-day operations of the ranch. They took long rides together, revisiting places that held special meaning for them. They spent hours on the porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. They told and retold the story of how they met, how Jacob had saved Wilhelmina from a cruel fate, how they had taken a chance on each other and built something beautiful from almost nothing. When Jacob was 68 and Wilhelmina was 66, they took a trip back to Santa Fe, something they had talked about doing for years, but had never quite gotten around to. They wanted to see the Palace Saloon where Jacob had played that fateful poker game, to walk the streets where he had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. The city had changed significantly in the 3 decades since Jacob had been there, grown larger and more prosperous. But the palace saloon was still standing. They went inside, and while it had been renovated and modernized, Jacob could still recognize the layout, could still point out the table where he had sat across from Marcus Holloway, and bet everything on a single hand of cards. "I was so scared that night," Jacob admitted as they stood looking at the table. "Not for myself, but for you. I kept thinking about what would happen if I lost, about you marrying Holloway, about never seeing you again. It was the most terrifying moment of my life." "But you did not let that fear stop you," Wilhelmina said, squeezing his hand. "You played the hand anyway. That is what courage looks like." They left Santa Fe the next day and made their way back to Foster Ranch, both of them content to be heading home. They had satisfied their curiosity about the place where their story had really begun, and now they were ready to return to the place where their story continued every day. As they entered their 70s, Jacob and Wilhelmina began to slow down more noticeably. Jacob's joints ached from decades of hard work, and Wilhelmina found that she tired more easily. But their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other, if anything, had only deepened with time. They had spent more than 35 years together, and they could communicate with a look or a touch, their connection so deep that words were often unnecessary. They spent their days mostly on the porch of the ranch house, watching the activities of the ranch continue around them. Their children and grandchildren visited frequently, bringing news and laughter and the energy of younger generations. Jacob and Wilhelmina offered advice when asked, but were content to let others make the decisions now, trusting that they had taught their children well enough that the ranch would continue to thrive. On a warm summer evening, not long after their 37th wedding anniversary, Jacob and Wilhelmina sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the air was filled with the sounds of the ranch winding down for the night. "You remember what I said to you that first time we really talked?" Jacob asked. "After church, when I told you I would do everything in my power to help you." "I remember," Wilhelmina said softly. "You said that from the moment you saw me, something in your heart recognized something in mine." "I meant it then, and I mean it now," Jacob said. 37 years later, and my heart still recognizes yours, still calls out to yours, still finds its home in yours." "And mine in yours," Wilhelmina said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Always and forever, my love, always and forever." They sat there as the stars began to emerge, holding hands, surrounded by the life they had built together, and both of them felt a deep, abiding peace. Their story had begun with fear and desperation, with a cruel man and an impossible debt, with a cowboy who rode through the night and made an audacious gamble. But it had become a story of love and partnership, of building something meaningful together, of creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Jacob lived to be 73, and Wilhelmina to be 71. They passed away within months of each other, unable to exist long without their other half. Their children and grandchildren mourned them deeply, but also celebrated them, knowing that they had lived full, rich lives and had loved each other completely right to the very end. The story of how they met, of the cowboy who won a bride's freedom in a poker game and then married her himself, became part of the family legend, told and retold to each new generation. Foster Ranch continued to operate for many more decades, a testament to the foundation Jacob and Wilhelmina had laid and the values they had instilled in their children. In the end, theirs was a story about the choices we make in impossible situations, about the courage to fight for what matters, about the transformative power of love and partnership. It was a story that began with "Marry Me Instead" and ended with a lifetime of happiness, proof that sometimes, even in the harshest circumstances, hope and love can triumph. And in the wild, untamed landscape of the New Mexico Territory in the late 1800s, Jacob Foster and Wilhelmina Ramsey had found not just each other, but the home and the future they had both been searching for all along.